Welcome to episode 27 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host, Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Before we start, here are our 3 main rules. First, our aim is to bring you an accurate presentation of classical Epicurean philosophy as the ancient Epicureans understood it, which may or may not be the same as what you read about Epicurus at other places on the internet today. Second, we aren't talking about Lucretius with the goal of promoting any modern political perspective. Epicurus must be understood on his own, and not in terms of competitive schools, which may seem similar to Epicurus, but are fundamentally different and incompatible, such as Stoicism, Humanism, Buddhism, Taoism, Atheism, and Marxism. Third, Epicurean philosophy is based on a fundamental view of the universe as natural and not under the control of any supernatural gods or ideals of virtue. As you study Lucretius, you'll find that Epicurus did not teach virtue or simple living as ends in themselves, but only as instruments in the pursuit of pleasure. For Epicurus, it is pleasurable feeling which provides the guide to life, within the context of the knowledge that there is no life after death, and that any happiness we will ever have must come in this life. And that's why it's so important not to waste time in confusion. Now let's join the discussion with Elaine reading today's text.
Further, those things which appear to us hard and thick must necessarily be joined together by particles more hooked among themselves and be held close by branched seeds. In the first rank of these you are to place the rocks of adamant that defy the force of blows, and solid flints, and the strength of hard iron and brazen hinges that creak under the weight of their gates. But liquids that consist of fluid bodies must be formed of seeds more smooth and round, for their globular particles are not entangled among themselves, and their fluid motion rolls on forward with the greater ease. But lastly, all such things which you observe instantly to scatter and fly away as smoke, clouds, and flame, if they do not consist altogether of particles that are smooth and round, yet neither are they formed of hooked seeds, and therefore may pierce through bodies and penetrate into stones, nor do their particles nevertheless stick mutually to one another, as we observe the particles of thorns do. From thence you may easily conclude that they are not composed of hooked or entangled, but of acute principles. But because you see the same things are bitter and fluid as the seawater, you are to wonder in the least at this. For what is fluid is formed of principles that are smooth and round, but with these smooth and round seeds are mixed others that are sharp and give pain. Yet there is no necessity that these sharp seeds should be hooked and twined together. It is sufficient that they be globous as well as rough, that they be qualified to flow along in their proper course, as well as to hurt the sense, and that you may the sooner believe that these sharp seeds are mixed with those that are smooth, from which the body of the sea becomes salt. The way is to separate them and consider them distinct. For the seawater grows sweet by being often filtered through the earth, and so fills the ditches where it becomes soft, for it leaves behind the pungent seeds of the rough salt, which are more inclined to stick as they pass along than those particles that are globular and smooth. This being proved, I shall here join another observation which justly derives its credit from what is explained before, that the seeds of things vary their figure not without end, but after a finite matter. If it were not so, some seeds, by an infinite increase of their parts, would be of an immense size. For in so small a body as an atom consists of, the figures have not room to change often among themselves. Suppose, if you will, these atoms or first seeds consist of smallest parts, 3, suppose, or a few more. If you please, by varying these several parts of one atom or seed into all possible shapes, placing the uppermost below or turning the right to the left, you will find the several figures that every change will give the seed in all its parts. But if you would change its figure still further, you must add new parts to it, and by the same reason, you must add still more if you think of changing its figure into more shapes, so that the body must increase in proportion as every new figure appears. And therefore, you cannot conceive that the seeds should be distinguished by an infinite variety of forms, unless that you admit that they are likewise infinite in magnitude, which, as I said above, is impossible to be proved. Besides the embroidered vests of Asia, the bright Melibbean purple dipped in the blood of the Thessalian shellfish, and the golden brood of peacocks, glittering with their gaudy plumes, would lie undistinguished, being exceeded by other things of greater luster, and the smell of myrrh and the taste of honey would be despised, and the singing of the swan in the noblest verse sung to sweet music would by the same rule be outdone and cease to please, for other things might arise more agreeable than these. And as some things we observe may advance into greater perfection, so others likewise may decline and grow worse. For one thing may succeed another still more disagreeable to the nose, the ears, the eyes, and taste. But since this does not appear in the nature of things, that there is a certain boundary to what is best and worst, we are obliged to own that matter is diversified by shapes that are finite and within fixed bounds. Lastly, from fire to the piercing cold of winter, a point is set. And so from cold to heat, they are both intense, for heat and cold are the extremes. The middle warmth lies between both, and thus orderly fills up the whole. This warmth is distant equally from both extremes, and is confined by bounds on both sides, kept in on this by heat, and on that by smarting cold.
Thanks, Elaine, for reading that.
Wow, I have some reactions to the third section here, but I think we should start with the first. But the third really jumped out at me as very different from anything that we've talked about so far.
Well, one thing that I was going to say is sort of a general framing of it before we get too far into it is that in looking at some of the commentators, one of the main points that's being stressed here is the fact that atoms cannot be infinite in size.
And that's the third. Yeah.
Which means that all of this is maybe another broad category to consider this within is something that DeWitt points out regularly, that again, we are using logic to try to derive the properties of the atoms. We're not able to see these things. We're not able to touch them directly. And so this would be another example of how Epicurus is both an empiricist of a way and also a logician.
Well, I want to say it leads to an important point about the problems with logic, that even if you base extrapolations on what you can see, once you get to the point where you're making conclusions and you can't see them, you're on shaky ground. And let me say, it's practical to rely on reason sometimes. It's just pragmatic, and there's not a problem with it, but it's better to maintain an awareness that if you're extrapolating from something you haven't seen, there's a decent chance you're missing something, and that's what happened here.
Well, what would somebody from that period say in response to that? Epicurus taught, especially in terms of astronomy, but in other cases as well, I think, about the fact that if you have an explanation that appears to be consistent with the facts, it doesn't always make a difference if that explanation is exactly what you conclude to be the final one. The important thing is to have an explanation that does not point towards supernatural divine control. And the important thing is that your explanation must be consistent with the evidence that you do have, and it must not be relying on something that you don't have. And it's the subject of waiting as well, the subject that you have to wait in terms of reaching a conclusion before you can say with absolute certainty that something is true. But isn't this like the issue, for example, of the stars or the movements of the heavens or whatever? It's an explanation that is reasonably plausible, and it gives you some confidence that you've got some kind of a grasp of the subject without relying on the gods being in control over it, while at the same time you recognize that you may find additional evidence later on, just as you were referring to, Elaine, that changes your precise explanation, but doesn't really lead you to another conclusion about the nature of the universe or the goal of life or the role of gods.
Okay, so I think we're not talking about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
If it's practical and it has use, if you can use the information to make decisions with and things are going reasonably well, it's okay to use, there's that quote, all models are wrong, but some models are useful.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's relevant to this. So if it's working okay, that's fine. But that is a different thing, that, provisional use of a model like this versus saying this is how we know it's true, assigning unwarranted certainty. You never need to do that. Just to be able to use information in planning or making decisions, or use a model in planning or making decisions, you don't have to have any kind of degree of certainty or acceptance that it's true to do that. You can just say, this is what we think might be going on, and we're going to use it. I would always keep in mind that whenever you're having hypotheses based on what you can see about things that you haven't examined, keep that in mind. That's part of science. Keep it in mind that there certainly could be all sorts of things that you don't know about that would change what's really going on. So I would say this is a mistake, not only in the science, which is fine. They didn't know those things. We don't know things now, but it's a mistake to describe it so securely. I don't agree with doing that.
This could maybe consume almost all of what we discussed today, because I think this is a fascinating issue of the relationship between, like you say, a scientific theory versus what is Epicurean philosophy. Is it really a scientific theory of the precise motion of atoms, or is it a philosophy of how to live given the information that we have? Because there's tons of material as we go through the book that we're going to find that we disagree with in terms of, from our modern perspective. So let's
separate out my philosophy and my science, though, Cassius, because, and maybe my version of the philosophy is a little bit different, but I see no need to firmly accept information that I have no evidence for. It's not necessary.
Okay, Martin and Charles, you guys weigh in at this point. Charles.
Yeah. So
I'm sorry, Martin. Go ahead.
Okay. So this one is just exemplifies how within the framework of hard body theory, which Epicurus came up with to think of the atoms, the variety of phenomena like hard bodies, fluid bodies, then smoke, this can all be explained by attributing this type of properties to atoms, that they have particular shapes which would lend themselves to make compounds, or which would rather lend themselves to stay separate and be more like a gas. So from that point, it's acceptable to me. But of course, we cannot expect that this model, this idea we have to make that whole thing consistent, is factual.
Martin, your very scientific background, as much as Elaine, or I started to say as much or more, but it's just a different background. She's medical, you're engineering or physics. Tell me what you think about the role of a preliminary theory or an interim theory, or the allegation that I think is pretty clear throughout a lot of Epicurean philosophy, that it's more important for you to have a plausible theory that gives you, as Elaine was saying earlier, something practical to work with than it is to be absolutely correct. What is your perspective on that?
And basically, I fully agree with whatever Elaine has said today so far. I just gave this comment that it's still useful to have these speculative ideas which are presented here, because of they can show that it within that simplistic model that there is the possibility to explain it all, and that is simply the purpose of it. For practical reasons, the ancient Epicureans did not even have to make this kind of assumptions on the atoms, because it didn't matter.
Okay, but where I'm going with both Elaine and with you is this issue of, I think both of you in your fields always keep in mind that there will be new evidence from new scientific research every day, every month, every year, every decade from now on. And yet you don't consider that your current understanding of the way to live is threatened or is undermined by the knowledge that your precise understanding today may be overturned tomorrow. You still have a general framework in which you have confirmation and confidence in your own mind that the operation of these physics or medical issues are natural and ultimately a function of these elemental particles, even though we may call them something different and understand them differently. You have a confidence in the way to live today that is not threatened or undermined by your knowledge that your precise understanding tomorrow may change. I think that's an explanation of what you and Elaine both are doing. Is that the way you see it, or do you see it differently?
I mean, it's similar to this. I guess Elaine is more confronted with change because there you can probably often find it that a newer study with better sampling or better analytical methods or whatever contradicts a past result. And
yeah, sure.
So then gets to something better. In physics, we do not have it that much. Of course, sometimes it happens that a theory gets outright refuted, but more typically, it's those older theories just get abandoned because the news are simply more powerful from a practical perspective and also from the power to explain things. So, and then these older theories, like these two prime examples I often refer to, the phlogiston theory for heat and the ether theory. In all their variations, they are not refuted. In those aspects where they would give measured predictions, they have been refuted. So, and by setting then upper limits to those boundaries which phlogiston and the ether would have, then eventually it turned out that these two concepts are just not useful, and they have been replaced with better models. So there is that difference with what we see in physics and between more practical science.
Okay. Go ahead, Elaine.
No, go ahead.
Well, I'm just trying to continue to follow this line. And again, I'm going to put myself in the very simplistic, common, everyday, uneducated category of people. And Charles is somewhere closer to you guys, but he's still kind of like me. He's not an absolute scientist, but you two are scientists and have a different perspective. Probably many people listening to the podcast are not going to be specialized scientists. They're going to have a wider gap and less confidence in their own understanding of the way the world works and the way the universe is set up. But everybody in their own context confronts that issue of the fact that they don't have all the information they would like to have. Even you guys with the physics and medical research don't have all the information you would like to have about how things actually work. And you keep in the back of your mind that some parts of your understanding may change as with new research. But how do you incorporate that on a daily life basis to both be comfortable with lack of total knowledge and yet have confidence that in general Epicurus is correct, that there's no gods, there's no life after death, that there's no reason to be really targeting anything other than pleasure and pain as the guides of life? How do you balance those competing considerations?
Okay, so for me, this is not something that you should have to be specialized to understand. We just are not teaching it. So it's not true that there's either only a sort of a faith-like, yep, we're going to accept this as it's that way because it's, or versus total skepticism. I think that it's a false dichotomy. So there's the most common approach, which actually what I observe ordinary people doing is pragmatism, that this looks most likely and we're going to go with it. So they may not explicitly be aware that they're doing that, but with education, they can be taught to understand that that's what they're doing. And I think it would be extremely important to teach people that for their own pleasure, because it would keep them from thinking that the options are just a total, I give up, who knows, anything, versus, we're dead certain about this. It would keep them from going down, maybe some of these conspiracy theories that make people unhappy if they could take a more pragmatic approach and be okay, have a little negative capability, as Keats would say. Just leaving some questions open does not have to lead to distress, but you have to have some practice at it. So there's no reason you need a PhD to be able to learn to think like that. And I would educate everybody about those things early on.
Let's go to Charles for a down-to-earth perspective, too.
Well, a lot has been said. I agreed with when you were responding to Martin about the importance of whether or not this knowledge has practical use. I think it's necessary that ideas and theories have to be accepted at first, sort of like a stepping ladder to build off of, as opposed to just total suspension of judgment about knowledge.
Well, Charles, your background is closer to mine, probably, and you're not a trained scientist in any field that I'm aware of. How much importance do you put in your own calculations? How much of your confidence, for example, that there's no life of death is based on study of physics or biology, things like that?
Oh, that's a tough one. I've always sort of held an interest in like the study of nature and sciences, chemistry in particular, but it's never been a career path or like a specialized interest. And so for those questions like life after death, is there a God and all that, I came to those conclusions way before I started taking scientific study seriously. And I didn't really look at those through a lens of confirming my religious beliefs, but I saw it as what's the word? Like, I didn't look at it through a confirmation bias, but it certainly reinforced it.
Right.
That's not the reason why I'm looking into research or read articles on, scientific sites or stuff going on in the medical industry.
Right. I get what you're saying. It's like there was nothing in it that undid the direction you're already going.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, yeah. So, Cassius, let me put another problem that I see in stating things as facts that you haven't seen based on extrapolation. It's an abstract process. So not only can it lead to wrong conclusions that will cause you to sometimes take action against your pleasure. That definitely happens. It's a habit of thought. So if you do it here, about physics, you're going to be in that habit about other things. And that is a habit that is counterproductive to pleasure in general. But here's another thing. If that's the way you think, I know, since I wasn't raised religious, but I know people who became non-religious who were raised in religions where you kind of you accepted the whole biblical teaching or whatever religion it was as this total system, kind of the way Epicurean philosophy is. It's a whole cloth thing. If significant parts of that system that you've been told are right, you find out directly that they're not true, that undoes their religion. That is, people learn some science things about the age of the universe, or the age of the earth, or things like that, and said, okay, well, then the rest of this is wrong. And that's a mistake to set your philosophy up on that kind of, it's flimsy. So I don't do it. As an Epicurean, I don't have any trouble with leaving things that are not known yet as empty places on the abstract map. It doesn't bother me at all. So if some of the things that Epicurus thought were true back then turn out not to be true, it doesn't undo the structure of my philosophy, which is a risk if you're making all of your reading about why the philosophy is true based on this. Then you're going to think, well, that was wrong. So what about the rest? But I don't think that's necessary.
Elaine, maybe we should address the question that I asked Charles a minute ago. In your situation, where did your confidence come from in your conclusions about life after death or lack of supernatural control of the universe? How much of your conclusions derive from, you've discussed in the past that your father was, I think, a physics professor, and so and lack of religious background. So
right.
You're probably, this is said with the greatest of respect, but you're probably in a very small minority of people, at least in the United States, who has had that kind of background. But regardless of how many people have that background, do you find most of your confidence coming from what? From that early teaching of a perspective of life from your parents, or from what?
So, yeah, I think mostly from science, not just from physics, but from neuroscience. And I think physicists and neuroscientists have the highest percentage of atheists. I may be wrong about that, but I feel like I've read that at some point. Evolutionary biologists. I have, this biology background, and there's just I'm like, where would you put the supernatural? I don't see any room for it. So all those things together, but I don't have a background I've read Vic Stinger's books, but I think I just took Physics 101 or 102. Of course, my dad talked to me about stuff, but it's not like I have a real strong background in physics. I wasn't a physics major or minor or anything like that. So I don't think you need that much. And I do know other people who, just reading something like a pop science kind of book like Vic Stinger stuff, you can get enough of it, even if you don't remember all the details, to be convinced. And then especially some of the pop neuroscience kind of stuff, I think, is sufficiently convincing. But Epicurus had a strong emphasis on science at his feasts. You're going to have to teach people some science if they're going to be able to understand this, but I would teach it in the proper form, which is not, just complete skepticism, but it is not strong confidence in things that you haven't observed. So it's a third option.
Well, part of my perspective as I think about what we're reading here is that I'm gathering that he's dealing with 3rd century BC people who don't have nearly the scientific understanding that we do today on a general basis. And so he's talking in many cases to ordinary people, but he's also talking to his students who are aware of the different philosophies that were competing with his in Athens.
Sure.
So I'm thinking that there's several different levels going on here, that he's including enough physics and general understanding of nature that anybody who comes into contact with the philosophy needs to understand. But he's also concerned with issues like, again, I think this section today is probably leading up to this issue of, is there a limit on the size of an atom? And although we haven't really got to that part of the detail of the discussion yet, that seems to be the conclusion he reaches, that I shall join another observation that justly derives its credit, that the seeds of things vary their figure, are not without end, but are finite. And so there's logical implications in his mind that he's dealing with to an allegation that the atoms might be infinite in number or infinite in size, that probably go back to some of the earlier logical arguments from Parmenides or others about all the issues that are involved in the concept of infinity. So there's several different levels that these things have to be analyzed on, and you can really go down rabbit holes in any direction. You can go a rabbit hole of physics and talk about the minutiae of why his theories have been superseded by our own knowledge, and you can go down a rabbit hole of talking about dialectical logical arguments about whether motion is possible and infinity and zero and things like that we have to sort of navigate between. But I guess the normal people aren't going to generally have to deal with issues like that in their day-to-day life. But I think he thought it was important to be able to provide a background that if you were in a context where you needed to deal with those challenges, you'd have a plausible response to them. Let's go back to Martin. Again, your background and your orientation. A lot of people come to Epicurus through Lucretius and through the science arguments about the swerve and so forth. Is that where you see your primary connection with him, or in another area?
So let me answer it first in the sense of the earlier question. So my confidence of no afterlife is not so much coming directly from physics, but rather indirectly, that any assumption on something supernatural being significant is superfluous. So there's nothing really from the phenomena we see for which we need anything supernatural to explain it.
Yes.
And the other thing is the obvious abuse of religion for political purpose. So this one shows that religion was just a smokescreen created by people who were basically insane and then used by power people.
Yeah, I really feel pretty strongly, Cassius, that the reason that you and other people who don't have a strong science background find this sort of maybe esoteric or unnecessarily geeky to talk about these things is because our education system is so crappy.
Right.
And I don't think that's any of this is some of the basic things that we understand now are over the head of average people. They're just, and the way of thinking about science, I don't think they're being exposed to it. But when I look at this, it looks to me like Lucretius here is doing something that really the philosophy says don't do. Philosophy overall, the process says use observations and not to get abstract beyond what you can observe. And here he's doing it, and it turned out to be wrong. So I would like people to take a lesson from this. Use caution with making conclusions about things that you have not tested.
I think your summary is clearly exactly what Epicurus and Lucretius are suggesting that people do. Maybe they had a more sliding scale in terms of, and I think they did have a more sliding scale in the sense of if they were confronted with what they considered to be a problem that they felt they needed to deal with urgently for some reason, they were more willing to take a position on it than, for example, just some theoretical issue that had no implication to them. I'm thinking that they wanted to be more confident in certain areas that we're discussing here because they saw threats that were specific from other philosophies that they thought they needed to counter, such as the infinity issue.
In doing that, don't use the tools that you have already noted as a problem with this philosophy. That's what I'm saying. It winds up undermining your philosophy to do that. I think it was a mistake. It's rare that I'm going to say that, but I kind of would be surprised at myself if I didn't think that certain things that Lucretius said, maybe were mistakes, but I think this was an error that they used logic in a way that was not supported by testing. Even if it's a defense, I don't use, these are tactics you're opposing with your opponents. Don't use their tactics that you've already said are wrong.
Charles, I don't know if you're able to help me remember the applicable statements from like the letter to Epicurus, but I know when he's discussing the astronomy issues, he makes several specific statements in that letter, and I'm talking about Epicurus, to the effect that we don't necessarily have to have a theory of everything, and that our science is, again, going back to what I was indicating before about if you've got a plausible theory, or if you have several plausible theories, that's better than, and if you have several plausible theories that are consistent, he takes the position then that if you have several plausible theories and you don't have the ability to choose between them, it's absolutely wrong to go ahead and choose between them. If you know your evidence is limited and there are several possibilities, then it's important for you to keep in mind that each of those possibilities could be valid and not to arbitrarily choose between them. Yeah. So there's issues of epistemology and issues of the canon here that when we get into the middle of these detailed discussions of the atoms are not present, but are still part of the overall philosophy for sure.
Yeah, I don't remember where exactly that is in the letter to Epicurus, but I know there's a section where he talks about having multiple theories and whichever ones harmonize well, or sort of like if you accept one thing and then deny another because what you accepted sort of appears or seems more consistent. Right here. Yeah, right here. But when one accepts one theory and rejects another, which harmonizes as well with the phenomenon, it is obvious that he altogether leaves the path of scientific inquiry and has recourse to myth.
Right.
You can't pick and choose between.
When you don't have enough evidence to do so. If the evidence supports the conclusion that you need to pick and choose, then you need to pick and choose. But if you don't have enough evidence, then that's when you wait until you have more evidence to take a position.
Yes. Right. Because you can't just accept the one that is more appealing to you.
Right. If you're taking a position because you think it's a better argument against your opponents or that people will like it better, then you shouldn't do it. And I feel like that's what's being done here. I disagree with the direction.
Go ahead, Charles.
It's like principle doctrine number 25. If on each occasion, instead of referring your actions to the end of nature, you turn to some other nearer standard when you are making a choice or an avoidance, your actions will never be consistent with your principles.
Yes. Thank you. That's it.
And that actually that brings me into a point that we haven't really discussed so much. So a lot of people are drawn in to Epicurean philosophy by Lucretius, or the fact that he was such a widely known proponent of atomic theory alongside Democritus back then. That's fascinating to a lot of people. And so they're drawn in by the scientific aspect. And the question then gets raised by a lot of people who are unfamiliar. Was Epicurus a scientist? Was he a natural philosopher? Was he a natural historian? And I think we should answer that he was, or it's been discussed before that the study of nature isn't for the sake of science and science alone. And so I believe that is what Lucretius here is trying to do. He is trying to provide an explanation that justifies the action or justifies his ethics. And if sometimes that required logic, then I feel he would be forced to.
So do you understand what I'm saying, in that if you prematurely accept conclusions because you think it supports your framework, that you could wind up undermining your happiness because it is hard to choose the most pleasure if you're not getting an accurate picture of reality and the consequences of your choices?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Epicurus would absolutely agree with the way you just said that, Elaine.
Yeah, so that is contrary to what he's doing here.
I'm not sure we're ready for closing comments yet, but we've kept the discussion on a pretty general high level of today without really discussing any particular sentences up close. Elaine, do you have any particular I know in general everything you've said today, and I agree with the general point. Is there anything in particular before we begin to reach the end of today's session that you wanted to point out from among this text?
Okay, well, actually, so I want to get to the third paragraph here in the Daniel Brown translation, which is, this is the first time that he has actually said the seeds have parts. And that is real different, because we've been talking this whole time that the seeds were the smallest parts, but now he is talking about the atoms having parts, like 3 or a few more. And so then, okay, then we got to backtrack a little bit. Then everything that has been said previously maybe is not talking about the seeds being the fundamental particles, the elementary particles. If they have parts, this is more like an atom having parts and subatomic particles, or really it almost sounds more like he's talking about molecules here, possibly as the seeds, and then atoms as the parts. But, I'm not sure. I just think that's really worth noticing, because I don't think at any time before he has said a seed has parts.
Martin, can you help us with that?
Yeah, I interpret this differently. So because from his concept of hard bodies as atoms, so he then came to it that they need to have quite complex shapes. And then, of course, if you take a complex shape, you can break it down in parts. You cannot actually take that atom into these parts. It's just that you can identify maybe there are 4 arms coming out of this. Okay, then this is now an atom which has 4 arms. And then by adding more arms, you create different atoms by just from the geometric construction. It's not that you actually build that atom. It's just that as you create the geometric shape, you then can identify the parts of the geometric shape and add more. But it doesn't mean that this atom is created of these parts. It's just that the geometric shape of it is made of pieces. And I think he's referring to this way of thinking of the atoms, that these are the parts of the atoms. So it's not that it can actually split into these parts. It's just that the shape is like built from these parts.
Okay. Well, it's not clear really which way he's doing it, but I could see that's a possibility.
I've read some detailed articles on this subject. Martin, your direction that you're taking is consistent with what I'm understanding most of the things that I've read to be saying, because obviously Elaine's comment is correct. If the atom can be divided into parts, then it's not an atom from the sense of an atom, because atom means undividable. So question appears to be something about the fact that, does this undividable atom have any kind of shape to it? And if it has a shape to it, does that mean there's a top and a bottom, or a left and a right, or does that mean there's an edge? And in fact, that's one of the books, isn't it? Is on the angle of the atom, meaning apparently is the edge of the atom or whatever. So no doubt there was a lot of theoretical discussion about whether an atom actually has sides and a shape, and you use the word arms, I think. I'm gathering that that's probably what is being talked about here, because he cannot have admitted that the atom can be actually divided into parts, because it's not an atom then. I see where Elaine's coming from.
Yeah, and so this argument is kind of assuming that, I guess, okay, the geometric parts, not the separable parts of an atom, you have to imagine that the parts themselves have a limit to their smallness, or this doesn't work, right? Because you could make a certain outline, a certain 3-dimensional shape. It doesn't have to get larger just because the contour changes, unless you are saying that there's a limit in how small it can get. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I guess he's also concerned about the limit of how big it can get. If you say that there's an unlimited number of parts, then presumably he's deriving from that somebody who alleges that it has an infinite number of parts is going to be trapped into concluding that it's infinite in size as well, because no matter how small the part is, if you keep adding them on, it gets bigger.
Yeah, but you still have to have a limit to smallness because you could just make it smaller when you added parts.
Right. So you've got both. If you have a limit to smallness, no matter how small it is, as long as it has a limit, it's got some size to it. And so if you say that thing of very small size, you've got an infinite number of them, I think you're almost trapped into saying that that's infinitely large in size.
Right. That's what I'm saying. If you don't say the part about the limit to smallness, you can't say the part about the largeness being an issue. You have to have both. And I don't gone over that yet about the limit and smallness yet. Or
Martin, you probably can answer that better than me. But yes, I think that's exactly what he's doing. He's taking a logical position that there's a limit of smallness, and the logical position that there's a limit of size as well.
But he hasn't said that about the smallness. So, it's not in that. You have to have it.
Martin, is your memory better than mine? Do you recall whether he said that there's a limit of smallness already?
I don't think this was said anywhere in the parts we've read so far.
Okay, all right.
So maybe you'll get to it.
Yeah, that's one artifact of I wish I had devoted my life to study of this book, and I was reading it every day, and I'd be able to immediately be able to answer that question. And I can't recall. I feel confident that it's in here somewhere, but I don't recall whether we've had it or not so far.
Just, you need that. If you're going to use that kind of logic, you have to have that, or it's not going to work.
Okay, now would be a good time to begin to think about closing comments for today. Who wants to go first? Martin, always Martin go first on closing comments.
Yeah, okay. So in this section, Lucretius gives examples of how this atomic theory works out by starting off from the, of course, two simplistic models of atoms as hard bodies. Then he comes to the then false conclusion that they have these hard body shapes, which then need to be have all kinds of hooks or something like this to be able to make compounds. But it doesn't matter that this one turns out to be at least misleading compared to modern science, because it was just to exemplify that within that theory things could be explained in full, and that is the value of this one, even though it should not be taken as a claim that this is in some way the truth. It's just that it's one model which follows out of some basic assumptions of the basic atomism, and then follows from there. And the other thing is that by adding now implicitly that that there is a minimum size of atoms, that this one puts a limit on how many different atoms there can be. That's it.
Okay, who's next?
Well, Charles, go next.
I don't have any closing thoughts. None this week.
Okay, I guess mine would be, which I'll probably say again here or there, that you can disagree with the strategy being used in Lucretius and still be an Epicurean.
Yes, and I would add to that to me, this is an example. I think we've had one of our better discussions today, and even on a section that really doesn't seem to have immediate practical use. If you just picked up Lucretius and went to this page, and you're a normal person in the year 2020, you're going to read this and not necessarily get anything out of it if you go straight to this passage.
You might roll
and you don't
your
have
eyes.
You're almost definitely going to roll your eyes. But the things that are being wrestled with here are really deep, but really practical to us even today. We have a much higher level of scientific understanding, even among the normal people who don't have a very good education, than they did in 300 BC. And yet we still have the same issue that no matter how educated we are, we do not have, and we're not going to have as long as we live, all the information we would like to have about how exactly things work together. And so we have to have in our own minds a philosophy, a frame of reference in which we decide what is important for us to know, what is not important for us to know, and what we're going to base our day-to-day decisions of life on. And that's where Epicurus, I think, leads in exactly the right direction. Elaine has pointed out over and over today that the specifics of his understanding of science have proven to us today to be incorrect. And yet the ultimate conclusion that he reached is I think most of us would say here today, is exactly correct. That ultimately, no matter what your level of scientific understanding is, nothing leads to the conclusion that there's a supernatural, divine fate that controls your life or a set of ideal virtues that tell you how to live. You basically have the feelings of pleasure and pain and the basic understanding of the universe that it's natural in form. And from that, you live your life as best you can. And Epicurus is a great guide for how to do that.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else for today from anybody?
No,
Yep.
not for
That's
me.
it.
Well, again, I think this has been one of our better discussions in a while, so I will work on getting this out to the internet as soon as possible, and we'll do it again very, very soon. So thank you very much.
All right. Hope y'all have a
All
good
right.
week.
Okay.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.